and like an eerie calm. Also very different from when Trump won in 2016, where that was like this moment of extreme panic and freak out. This feels much more resigned. Sorry, that's my daughter appropriately.
It's perfect for the family episode. Don't worry
Yeah,
about
exactly. But yeah, no, this feels much more resigned. It did not feel like the apocalyptic, chaotic day freak out from a lot of liberals. They kind of just felt like, oh, yeah, I guess. And I think that's to a certain extent because they kind of knew in their hearts that she wasn't a very good candidate and
Yeah.
didn't run a very convincing campaign. And the Democrats hadn't really done much in the ensuing 4 years to really make inroads among the constituencies they really needed. So it's, it didn't surprise me particularly that Trump won. It did surprise me that he won the popular vote. The scale of the victory actually did surprise me a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's the same things that we've been saying for almost 10 years, right? The level of frustration and economic struggles among the middle of the country, the deindustrialized parts of the country, and now extending that into the Sun Belt and parts of the country that are more racially and ethnically mixed, should show that this sort of wave of frustration has a lot less to do with racism and sexism than many of the liberals had been saying for the past 10 years or so. On top of that, I think the party was really hurt by its cultural appeals, which they kind of thought they could get away with if they did a little bit of pro-labor work, a little bit of populism, that people would swallow some of the more unpopular cultural appeals. And it's obviously that's not the case. I mean, the big story of the election is obviously inflation. That's the number one thing people are voting on, right? Inflation. And people are really frustrated by inflation. Now, that said, you can't say, well, it was always a foregone conclusion. There's no way to win in an inflationary environment. Obviously, people like AMLO were able to get a successor in office in a very similar inflationary environment with a much poorer population, by the way, right? Who are hurt disproportionately more by higher prices. So it's not impossible to beat the inflation wave, but it is impossible to beat the inflation wave if you're campaigning on democracy, sort of vague democracy things, and your image is fundamentally one of an elite party that caters to the college-educated urban set. Then it becomes very difficult to win because who's going to believe you? Who's going to believe that you're actually trying to do something about prices?
But also, I think, it's also important to remember that inflation was also the result of democratic policies as well. Not least with Ukraine, which also, connected, if indirectly, to the Trump vote, in that I think people associated him with less international disorder and his promise of fewer wars under his administration and so on. So I think that was also part of it. So, and also the fact of lockdown policies, pro-lockdown policies, leading to all the supply chain disruption and price gouging and profiteering that resulted from that. So it's only to say inflation, wasn't, it wasn't something that fell out the sky. It was also the result of policy choices. And I think Trump had, sufficient distance from them politically, partly by a result of losing the last time around, but also in the kind of, he kind of cottoned on to it in the fading weeks of his last run in the previous election when he was doing all the YMCA dancing at his rallies, when it was still kind of in the fag end of lockdown, or fag end for our non-British listeners is to say the dying days of lockdown, when the end of the cigarette, as it were. And then he was kind of, it's okay, relax, have a good time. You're not all going to die because of the virus. So, yeah, it's only to say, I think it's important also to caveat the fact that inflation was a political, that was also a political choice.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco,
welcome back to BungaCast. We're delighted to have back on Dustin Guastella, who I forgot to ask him for his bio, so I'm going to invite him to introduce himself.
Sure, yeah. I'm the Director of Operations for Teamsters Local 623, and as a volunteer, I do some research for the Center for Working Class Politics here in Philadelphia in the United States.
Very good. Delighted to have you back on, and we're here to talk about, well, in Maine, about your article, In Pursuit of the Family, from the third issue of Damage Magazine called Mothers. You've probably heard this already, listener, but there's going to be a launch event in New York if you're in or around that area. Do come along. It'll be Catherine and you in conversation with someone called Dustin Guastella, which sounds really interesting. That'll be on Saturday, the 23rd of November in New York at MoMA's PS1 in Queens at 4 p.m. More the information is also linked here in the show notes. George and I are going to be there as well, but don't let that put you off. You should come anyway. And we anyway hope to see you there. And we're going to be discussing at that event. There's going to be kind of discussions along similar lines to what we're going to be discussing here about the family and what a pro-family policy might look like, or policies or general approach might look like. Before that, just a little bit more on the U.S. election. So, Phil.
So, we were curious about to hear, given so you work for a union, and so we were wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the union reaction, because that seems to have been a bit. We haven't seen much of that kind of internationally from the international press and the lens of the foreign media. They haven't really been covering what the unions have been saying and doing. So have you got any ear to the ground, anything you can tell us about what the debates are within your union or the union movement more generally?
Yeah, so going into the election, I think everybody in the labor movement was very much aware that the rank and file were not excited about Harris, and that it was going to be a really tough sell. When I was at the gates trying to convince people. Winnie, can you leave Daddy alone for a little bit?
She can say hi one
You want to say
time.
hi?
She can
Okay,
say hi
say
one
hi
time.
one time. Say hi one time. This is Winnie. Say hi one time. Okay.
Hi, Winnie.
One time.
Bye.
Sorry about that, guys. No, so in the lead up to the election, I think many union officials and political campaigners inside the labor movement knew this was going to be a really hard sell. When I was at the gates in my barns, those are our UPS warehouses, it didn't surprise me. Many people did not want to hear our pitch. They didn't want to hear about Harris. They didn't want to hear what was going on. Now, in the wake of the election, I think many in the labor movement are very worried. Trump has staffed his transition team full of the most odious anti-labor people that you can find. And I think it's going to be a real question whether or not Trump is going to prioritize the kind of interests that the billionaire class really want to crush the labor movement once and for all, or if he doesn't really care that much about that. I'm not sure. It's tough to tell from what he talks about and how he acts. But there's a real fear across the labor officialdom that, and the rank and file who are paying attention, that the new regime is going to be pretty brutal toward the labor movement. Elon Musk alone, who has now sort of he's become basically Trump's VP. It seems like he's doing more of the talking and spokesperson position than JD Vance is. Musk has a lawsuit in the Supreme Court right now, which would invalidate the entire regulatory apparatus that protects the labor movement and makes the labor movement legal. So there is a real fear that the union movement could be under threat. But it all comes down to, two things. One, state capacity. The Republicans are notoriously bad at actually competently using the state. So that could work to the advantage of the labor movement if they're not able to effectively wield state power. And two, the priorities, right? Whether or not the Trump administration really wants to prioritize this as a thing. But the personnel are there and the ideology is there. They are completely able to gut the labor movement with this, a single swoosh of the pen. So there's a genuine anxiety among the rank and file and the leadership of the labor movement right now.
So would you say it's kind of J.D. Vance as the potential leader of the pro-labor wing of MAGA and Elon Musk as his opponent?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call Vance pro-labor, but he's definitely less hostile than Musk, right? I mean, Musk, I think, and the scary part is that Musk has clearly won over Trump in a way that Vance has not. I think it seems to me, at least, that Vance and Trump are not as simpatico on these issues as Trump and Musk are. At least from the dying days of the campaign, it seemed like much more of a Musk campaign than a Vance campaign. Now, again, Vance's labor positions, I think he says a lot of great stuff in the press, but you have to remember that the American system is kind of institutionally conservative toward labor. And for somebody in the Conservative Party to be not as hostile to labor, it doesn't mean we're going to get good labor laws. It simply means the gas pedal on the attack isn't going to be as strong. So it's very tough to see how Vance and the kind of that wing of the Republican Party are going to express any pro-labor sentiment when the last round of judges and NLRB appointments that Trump put in office were historically anti-labor. This round is probably going to be historically even more anti-labor. So even though rhetorically I think they will get through to a certain type of moderate swing state Republican official, whether or not they're going to be able to do anything institutionally at the court and NLRB level seems, I think the chances are zero.
Can you tell
Yeah,
us a bit more about the detail of this court case and when we might expect to hear and what's at stake and what the issue is that's actually before the court?
Yeah, so I think that it's going to be a little while before this makes its way all the way up, depending on how things shake out. But effectively, Musk has teamed up with one of his longtime rivals, Jeff Bezos, and there's a third person in it as well. But they're basically challenging the constitutionality of the NLRB. If you read this stuff, Matt Brunick has written some really good stuff on this if you're interested in the minutia of it. But effectively, the American labor law structure is run through what is called the National Labor Relations Act, which created the National Labor Relations Board. And as I understand it, what they are challenging is that because the National Labor Relations Board is not a court and does not have a judge, all of its rulings are effectively illegal because it does not comport with the constitutional understanding of the way in which laws are meant to be enforced. Now, any time before now, this would have gotten thrown out of the Supreme Court because the precedent has been set for nearly 100 years. It's very strong. There's a good understanding of how the NLRA and the NLRB are meant to work. Both parties have the opportunity to appoint people to the NLRB. It's not clearly a pro-labor board in the sense that it's not trying to increase labor density. It is merely trying to enforce the law of the legality of unions and their contracts. But Musk and Bezos are basically saying, no, that's wrong. And with the Supreme Court as it is, and the Supreme Court could get worse under Trump, there's a good chance that could pass. And if it does, the labor movement would go back to a semi-legal state in which the existing strong unions would probably be able to muscle their way through, but unions in weaker areas without the political backing would die pretty quickly.
I mean, and that would, to the extent that there's been a slight uptick in unionization and union activity in recent years, what would be the effect of that? I mean, obviously, you would assume that it would be pretty chilling, but
disastrously chilling. I mean, it already, like, a Trump election is already going to be chilling, I think, on a lot of workers. But if we don't get to say that your union activity is legally protected and it becomes legally contested, workers who are already quite skittish about signing a union card are going to run the other way. It's going to be very difficult to convince workers that they should risk their jobs for something that is semi-legal or illegal. Whereas right now, when we go around and talk to workers, we can say your union activity is protected by the government. It is legal. You are legally protected. This is legally protected activity. And that goes a long way because a lot of people are under the impression that they could, not just get fired, but actually get in legal trouble if they participate in union actions. And that would be true if this Supreme Court case was decided the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, for all the talk of like techno feudalism or whatever, and I have a point on that in a second, but it's kind of undoing of so many 20th century structures. If that were to come to pass, so it would be more like in something more analogous to late 19th century capitalism than to.
Well, and that's kind of what our politics looks like now, isn't it?
Right. Well, exactly. So, and it's interesting. You mentioned the kind of the sort of Musk-Vance divergence, and I think it's interesting because those two capture, to a certain degree, two post-neoliberal tendencies, right? I think people would associate Musk with a continuity of neoliberalism, obviously, but I think that would be to define kind of neoliberalism too broadly. I think it certainly points to a capitalism which is much more nakedly oligarchical, in a way that neoliberalism was a much more ordered, constitutionalized sort of phenomenon. And then the Vance one also as a kind of an attempt at a quote unquote pro worker conservatism, however abortive that would end up actually being in practice, nevertheless kind of pointed in a different direction. So it's interesting to see that laid out starkly, and it'll be interesting, I think, to see how that plays out. I think you've said that Musk. It seems like pretty clear that Trump has opted for the Musk route, but I wonder how much that's a question of personality versus political choices, which will play out over
we'll
his term.
see. I mean, one of the other big things that has happened this election that wasn't the case in 2016 is the degree to which Musk represents not just Musk and not just big tech, but a certain faction of the billionaires that have decisively come over onto the Republican side, right? The Republicans have now won, I think, something like over 70% of all billionaire donations came to the Republican Party. The Republicans have run, I don't know the numbers on this, but a historic roster of 100 millionaire candidates. So here in Pennsylvania, Dave McCormick, who's worth several $100 million, unseated Bob Casey for Senate. In the middle of the country, there were two other huge 100 millionaire candidates that unseated ordinary kind of regular Democrats. And the GOP has made made a very clear tactical decision that they're only going to run candidates in really expensive races that can self-fund. And that basically limits it to people who have $100 million or more. So not only are the donations kind of flowing into the GOP, but the candidates themselves are getting richer and richer. So you have this very strange situation in the party right now where they're at once the party of the people, in that they've won decisively the kind of class base that should traditionally be on the left, and they are increasingly the party of the rich in both their official office holders and their donor base. So we really do have an 18th Brumaire situation going on, and it's very strange to see how the party is going to navigate these things.
Right. No, I mean, we were talking in our last episode, which came out on Friday, about with Matt Karp on the U.S. election, and talking about the composition of the parties. And Matt Karp made the point that so much of American capital is now with the Democrats, both ideologically as well as kind of economically, and it nevertheless, I think, remains that the Democrats are the party, and perhaps increasingly so, party of the professionals. So it's the party not of the 1%, but of the 10% or something like that, and that the conflict, the class conflict expressed in political party terms in the U.S. today has rearranged in such a way that you have now professionals against a section of the working class and oligarchs and millionaires. And my understanding was also that I think you made this point to me by email actually the other day, Dustin, like that the Republican Party has traditionally been over the past decades more penetrable to kind of its billionaire and millionaire donor interest than the Democrats who have a far more kind of bureaucratized structure where the professionals actually rule. And so I guess this underlines a point made by Michael Lind already, probably over a decade ago now, of kind of this of the kind of class struggle that is going on in the U.S. is one between the 10% and the 1%, or some kind of formulation like that.
Yeah, no, I think it's appropriate to think about it in these terms because there is something bizarre about the class frictions in American politics, and I think it has something to do with the outsized weight of the media and the sort of discursive uh, professions, right, and their ability to really affect the political parties, especially the Democratic Party. But it seems as though the Democratic Party is effectively a coalition of the professionals and the very poor, right, who are very dependent upon certain state benefits. Meanwhile, the Republican Party, at least in this election, has become a coalition of the extreme rich and the middle income and blue collar part of the working class, right? So you have this kind of class friction where you have these two different coalitions that are kind of missing each other, but it creates this tremendous amount of disjointed friction in American politics because there's no clear. It's not like in the 19th century we would look at this and it would be something more like this. There would be like the 1% and the middle class would be here, and then you'd have
People, listeners need to check out the video for this so you can see what
sorry,
Dustin's doing with his fingers to illustrate. No, it's very good. It's very good. But I'm just telling listeners, if you're just doing audio, you need to get on the video on YouTube or wherever. You got to see
But
this.
when the class friction looks like that, in other words, when it's the sort of working class, a section of the middle class and the poor on one side, and a section of the middle class and the rich on the other side, the class friction is extremely clear. It makes a lot of sense. It's the way in which parties campaign is sort of very intelligible. But when the class friction is the ultra rich, the sort of middle income blue collar versus the high income professionals and the very low income bottom end of the working class and even the underclass, when it's that friction, you have this very strange mix of appeals that don't quite make sense. And I think this is partly why the Democrats have such a hard time getting a handle on how to appeal to that missing chunk, because who's left in the party are simply not that chunk, and they don't speak like or act like or think like that group that they're trying to appeal to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it becomes much more clearly a party of the professionals. I mean, I speculated that the direction that the Democrats are going in now is kind of social liberal chauvinism, which is to say something similar to what liberal, very centered liberal parties, liberal in European terms rather than American terms, parties in Northern Europe, like in Holland, Sweden, Germany, where you've got these parties who, because it's a multi-party system, they don't have to appeal, and they're not really able to appeal to a broad mass of people. They don't have to speak for the working class. It can become much more a party of the free market, of NATO, but of social liberalism. Like basically we're with the gays, and if you don't like the gays and you're brown, well, you can fuck off, right? And it's a much more narrow appeal. But they can do that in a kind of multi-party system because they have their narrow base of electorate. Like maybe the kind of Free Democrats in Germany might be an example that people are familiar with. But also, arguably it's the direction which Pim Fortuyn charted out in the Netherlands, 2 decades ago. Although that was framed in kind of an anti-immigration politics, which I think in the U.S. it would be on the opposite side of the pole, right? I think the Democrats will remain the party
I
of
was going to say, but the Democrats have been
immigration.
doing. I mean, surely the Democrats have been doing that, right? I mean, that's the point. That's why they're here, and
Yeah.
if they're to survive, and I mean, I think they will. I think they'll politically recover in due course. But the electoral system will encourage them, incentivize them to rebuild that working class appeal. And I imagine they're likely to do it. They're kind of likely to break down or try to kind of box out of the corner they're in, but they'll probably do it in ways that mimic the chauvinism of Trump, rather than kind of trying to construct a more internationalist vision of what national renewal might look like. So it's predictable to that extent, I think. But I think, I mean, there'll be incentives for them to try and fight out in a way that the social liberal parties you mentioned, Alex, don't have any incentive to do because they can still win elections in continental countries with PR.
Yeah, I think that's right, Phil. And to the point about how they're going to shift, we've already seen it happen, right, under Clinton, when the last time the Republicans had a wave working class election, the Democrats took about 10 years after Reagan to regroup, and then they did regroup in the form of Clinton. And what did Clinton, what was the populism of Bill Clinton? It was not just a sort of social conservatism, but also a liberal conservatism, right? A liberal market conservatism. And that's my fear right now with the Democrats, is that they will learn the same lesson, which is to say, all right, we hear you, working class, and we're going to move to the right on cultural issues, but we're also going to move to the right on economic issues. We're going to become an even more low tax. We're going to become even more anti-immigrant. We're going to become all of these things without actually offering any genuine kind of um, policy of industrial renewal or wage increases, or building out the social state in any meaningful way.
Well, the
And
conclusion on inflation probably is already that, right?
yeah,
Like, well, we probably did kind of cause inflation with Build Back Better and all that. We should do less, rather than it obviously, this then being chucked out is testament to the fact that Build Back Better didn't was nowhere near thoroughgoing and immediate enough either.
right. Also, like, if you're a serious party about these questions, like, what is your option here? If inflation is going to kill every spending program, well, you better get pretty creative about how to deal with inflation. Or you can say, we're never going to do spending programs, but that leaves you as a permanent minority party, because the conservatives will always be better at destroying the social state. There's no, like, you're never going to out flank them to the right on those sorts of questions. So you're left in, and this is, I think, the crisis that center left parties have been left in for the past 50 years, which is we chase the right in these elections. Then we find that we can't chase the right as effectively. We try to offer sort of, a small package of social spending. We get into hot water with, overheating the economy or something like that, often things that have very little to do with the social spending itself, and immediately revert to, well, we can't do anything. We can't even touch social programs or try to offer anything at all. Let's just, move back, pull back, and define ourselves as like the more competent version of the conservative party. And that seems like the cycle the left has been stuck in, the center left has been stuck in for
Well,
a
I mean,
very long time.
arguably the Democrats are the conservative party, whereas the the Republicans are kind of a nationalist party. If we kind of if you were to rebrand them, looking at them afresh without the weight of history, that's probably the terms you would opt for, closer to than the ones that they have right now. I wanted to ask you whether you had anything else to add on anything else that struck you about the election. I think the question of inflation is interesting. You mentioned about the comparison with Mexico and AMLO. I would actually draw the opposite conclusion, though, insofar as in Mexico and in many other Latin American countries, they've had to deal with very high inflation in living memory, and have been beaten down by that experience through the 80s debt crisis and onwards. And so people have learned to suffer and survive through that in a way that it proves less politically combustible than it does in the US and in other kind of Western, advanced democracies, where they haven't had to deal with inflation for quite a long time, and certainly not very high levels of inflation, and so it acts as more of a shock when it does come in than in somewhere like Mexico, I think. So I think to a certain extent, AMLO was able to politically see it off by raising the minimum wage in particular, and through some other measures. But I do think probably inflation would have less of an immediate impact.
Yeah,
There. But anyway,
that's
yeah.
you know better than I do. I mean, but my main point with saying that is to say that if the takeaway is inflation killed the election, for a center left party, that effectively says you can't do anything economically ever, because no matter what you do could have some inflationary pressure, which means there's simply no reason to offer any economic policy. And if a center left party can't offer economic policy, all it can offer is, as you say, social liberal chauvinism. And if all it can offer is social liberal chauvinism, well, its electorate has just shrunk down to 30%. There's
Yeah, yeah.
the only utility of a left-wing party is to be able to offer some kind of social protection against the rapaciousness of the market. And if they're incapable of ever doing that, then they're cooked.
But then we should celebrate, surely. In terms of teasing out the political possibility of the moment, the Democrats not offering any longer, I mean, I don't think they did before, but any kind of vehicle for any kind of left-wing politics, let alone a radical left-wing politics, then surely that is, if there's a learning moment, there's something to be learned there, right? The Republicans won't be able to really develop into a party of the workers as some of their advocates seem to, or some of the advocates of that position seem to believe is possible. The Democrats become much more explicitly a party of the professionals, and then there's nowhere left to go within the established duopoly, and that's good. I mean, if that's something that is actually learned.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's one that's one positive way to look at it. I mean, the way I see it is because the American party system is sort of dynamic and stable, decline is the most likely outcome, right? I mean, Phil said before, they will learn some lessons from this, from a purely electoral position and a way to win back a coalition. But those coalitions are very likely to continue to be kind of razor thin 50-49 coalitions back and forth without any sense of rebuilding what a majority coalition really looks like, which means having a kind of stable political identity that it can deliver on, that the majority of the working class actually agrees with. So I think there are a couple things here that need to be sort of put in context. Unlike the European or Latin American contexts, the American parties do not wither and die because they've failed, right? They fail all the time and manage to just kind of keep on keeping on. It's a nature of the duopoly. Now, they can crack up, but they will crack up in Congress, right? They won't crack up in the electorate. The last time this happened, before the Civil War, there was this tremendous party crack up over a huge social cleavage that forced the parties apart, right? So you had a duopoly and then it broke into multiple parties. That can happen, although it's even harder now than it was then for it to happen. But in order for it to happen, there needs to be massive, massive social cleavages, right? It's not likely that electoral effects do that. I think the things that can do that are wars, and pretty bleak, very sort of dark social crises can force the parties to crack up in a certain way. But the more likely outcome is they will keep on keeping on. Both parties will be unable to deliver anything significant, but one party will, time and again, win a majority, right? And they'll be able to pass a few laws and sort of limp forward with this massive sort of empire-sized economy that the United States has. And that's a big factor, right? Unlike many other countries, the United States just has this giant thing that enough people are so invested in keeping afloat that the parties don't really have to really adjust in order to make it work. They need to adjust electorally, but they don't need to adjust in terms of like a real refounding of what their mission is and rethinking of how they approach politics.
Right, so let's turn to the question of the family. Make this argument in Damage. It's a great essay making the case for pro-family policies or a pro-family approach as a social and a socialist, indeed, argument. Maybe it's obvious, or maybe it's telling that the question even needs asking, but what do we mean by family here? Hi there, friends. This is the end of a sample from an episode available only to subscribers at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers get at least 4 original exclusive episodes a month, featuring Alex, George, and Phil, as well as our regular contributors, Alex Gurovich, Amberly Frost, Catherine New, and Lee Phillips. We've got episodes on current affairs, extended interviews, exclusive episodes on theory, history, culture, docuseries, analyses of film, and our responses to listeners' questions and criticisms. And for $12 a month, you also get access to the very special BungaCast Reading Club, where we present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Of course, if you just want to try us out, there's also a $3 entry tier giving you one exclusive episode a month. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. We tried to find some political clarity so that we might move beyond the age of bunga bunga.
Dakar ou Brasilia, go